invitation to speak. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the projects. I think this has been actually my most exciting and inspiring project that I've worked on in the last few years. It's called the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes, and I'm guessing several people in the room have also heard about it. But today I'm going to use that to set the scene, and I think the work that we're doing and Kezia's poster and work in particular really focuses on a lot of kind of bottom-up initiatives and experiments for trying to do things differently, which I think is also really much a hallmark of this community and probably quite a lot of the work that you yourselves are doing and that I'm looking forward to hearing about during the course of this week. Okay. Apparently I just need to press really hard. There we go. Okay. The motivation or context for this project is this notion that we live in the Anthropocene, which, as many of you know, at the moment is not defined as a new geological era, but I think is very much seen as a significant new period in Earth's history, where human activity at the global scale is now a dominant force shaping how the Earth functions. And we know that, for instance, through changes in the climate and temperature, but also many other parameters, including changes in nutrient flows, pollution, ocean acidification, etc. And I like also this way of thinking about it, that this era or this context for the current stage in which we live is not just about changing sort of the rules of the game and how we do things and how we live on Earth, but it's also changing the playing field. So it's changing the very Earth on which we live and depend. And that's kind of the context for this project, and I think for a lot of work that all of us are engaged in. These changes, or this era of the Anthropocene, are really rooted in our systems of production and consumption. And two very significant ones are a large-scale industrial crop production, but also global connectivity. And that's both through physical movement of people, for instance, through global air or shipping travel, but also digital connectivity, which has really grown massively. And these changes are associated with multiple interconnected challenges across local, national, regional, and global scales. And I think those are very much the challenges that we're dealing with at whatever scale maybe our primary focus is. So whether it's the fires here in Neisner, the COVID pandemic, inequality, etc. So I think that kind of is just a little big picture sort of context for the motivation for this work. And I think, much of the work we're doing in the social ecological systems field, but it's really the sense that there's this clear need for kind of large systemic transformational change to address these challenges. But at the moment, we're still, it's not clear what such a sustainable and just future might look like. And this is really where this project or this initiative has come in. And I think it was also motivated coming out of earlier work, for instance, in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but a lot of global scenarios work and regional scenarios work looking at the environment and feeling many of these futures are very dystopian. And that really we need to start thinking about what could positive futures look like. And not just one positive future, but what are kind of different options and different ways in which we could have a good Anthropocene. And we were particularly interested in this project in looking at what are perspectives maybe from non-dominant cultures and regions in the world that can maybe also give us alternative ideas for how we might do things. And this is very much also informed by work in psychology and management research about how important these inspirational visions are in terms of kind of change management in general, but especially if we're also thinking about transformations to sustainability. And I think we often also use the word sort of from systems thinking, this idea of an attractor. So if we've got some sense of, okay, we're trying to go in this direction, then all of our myriad different efforts can sort of try to align a bit in that direction. Whereas if we don't really have direction, we're just going all over the place and maybe not moving at all. And those visions can really help shape how we make sense of the world and then how we act. So the underlying premise for this project is really that meeting the Anthropocene challenge is not just about tweaking sort of the way we do things, but it's really, most likely it requires a kind of a large, deep systemic change, probably on the order of the shift from agrarian to industrial times. So it's a large kind of reorganization and a fundamental shift in our underlying worldviews, assumptions, and values that shape individual choices and societies. So yeah, and I think this is really where I feel we're kind of also trying to push a little bit at the boundaries of some of the kind of more dominant sustainability kind of discourse. That is not, I think some of the initiatives going on are really important and maybe sort of steps in addressing, I think the enormous challenges we face, but in a sense, they're not changing the underlying logic of how we're living and the underlying paradigms by which we're engaging with each other or with nature, or how we're kind of consuming and living in this world. And what would it take to try to reimagine how we do that and maybe reconfigure the ways that we see how we relate to nature, and also our responsibilities towards nature and to other people. So that also brings us why we focus on this idea of seeds, and the seeds is a metaphor. So some of them could be real seeds, but in general we're using that as a metaphor. But the reason for this is that it's, and again this is kind of also partly kind of from psychological research, is that it's almost impossible to imagine really radically different futures. So it's sort of like someone living in medieval kind of agrarian times trying to imagine industrial times or today. It's almost impossible, even though we actually got there relatively quickly. But what we do know from kind of systems change is that often radical change emerges from these kind of small seeds or sort of pockets or experiments that are actually present in the system already. And that, so these big changes don't sort of come from nowhere. They often come from inside the system, and the things that are sort of generate that change can already be present in the system, but they're quite marginal. And so this project is really about trying to find these kind of metaphorical seeds, which we think about as these new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things. Also new institutions, I think, are really important. New technologies, those we're getting a lot of, but they're also about harnessing those for the good. So just some examples of seeds to ground this. So we've got a whole online database, and I'll put up the website again at the end. But for instance, we've got some work around community currencies, looking at different kind of land ownership models, looking even at the use of urban space and how maybe informality can be incorporated into the local economies, maybe some of the innovations around how we do fair trade. So we've got a whole range of different kinds of examples. We've also been working on a kind of a theory of change in this project, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about this, but it really integrates two of the dominant kind of theoretical frameworks in the sustainability field, which is from kind of social-ecological transformations and then from social-technical transitions. So I'll just quickly to say that in terms of thinking through this theory or this process of change, we think about kind of these three big sort of phases around sort of preparing for change, which in a sense is the phase that we're focusing on because we feel that's where we are. But then there's also kind of navigating the transition, which potentially we're kind of already into. And then how do we actually kind of consolidate and stabilize those kind of new regimes? And then we think about this as occurring across different scales. So in this first phase, down here at the bottom, you see these little triangles. Those are sort of our metaphorical seeds. And the idea here is that these kind of different experiments are also inspired by these kind of big emerging discourses and narratives around what the problems in the world are. And I think what we see now, what's nice about this project is that once you start looking around, you find there's a lot of really interesting, innovative, and inspiring stuff going on. And probably some of that has been going on for a long time, but I think also the current situation we're facing, there's definitely a lot of new stuff, kind of seeds coming up all over the show with new ideas. And it's really about those then kind of becoming a little bit connected because basically we need to build like an alternative whole system. So even if you think about changing the transport system, it's not just about new technologies in cars. You know, you need new ways of then having recharging batteries or filling them up. And you maybe need new kinds of road infrastructure. So it's like you need a whole bigger system change, and it's the same with the food system. So it's about linking these different innovations, which often only focus on a little piece of the system, and you need to start kind of linking them together. And so this second phase around navigating the transition is often focusing on taking some of these, what are called these proto-regimes. So they like have a few of these different innovations that have become connected in a kind of a prototype alternative system and institutionalizing that. And that can be institutionalized sort of within a municipality or a town, or it could be at a provincial level or even at a national level. So you kind of try to now, it's not just something that is on the margin, but it actually becomes part of the system. But I think the big challenge, and we see that if we look across history around these innovations, is that there's also a lot of forces suppressing those changes. So they can either kind of just flatline and sort of get stuck there at the particular level. So maybe you get it into one municipality, but it never goes further to sort of drive bigger change. Or in some cases, kind of new innovations just kind of get squeezed out, so they go down again. Or what we're actually trying to look at is how can we then scale that up to actually have bigger systemic change that's at the scale needed to address kind of the big environmental and biodiversity challenges that we face. So in this project, we're really looking from these little seeds down here, which is part of the focus, and I'll talk about that now. And then thinking about what are these future visions or scenarios of where we might be headed. And then the big work that we're really engaging now is to think around these pathways. And so also trying to think how do we develop maybe or build on some of the existing work, but I think there's a lot of work to do there to really maybe have more systematic ways of thinking through what the options are in a very kind of co-production approach where we engage different relevant stakeholders and really kind of try to embed what it is that we're collectively trying to do or achieve in a particular place or region. So this was a little bit theoretical, but I think often people find that quite useful just as a framing. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more practically through the different components of the project. So I've sort of divided into 5. So firstly, I think quite a lot of work in this project, and the project is based, I should have said that up front, it's kind of a big international initiative that's got people involved all over the world. And I helped found that project together with some people, or Gary Peterson from the Stockholm Resilience Center and Elena Bennett at McGill University in Canada. And we coordinate this network, but it's been a sort of a self-growing network, and people have become inspired by the work, and then they get their own funding and are doing their own projects and variations on this. But we've got quite a big hub of this in South Africa, both at the CST, but also at a couple of different places around the country, including at WITS, where Laura Pereira is. And she's also leading a lot of this work. So firstly, we kind of do quite a bit of work on identifying and collecting these examples of these seeds. That's both through people kind of can submit them online on our website, but then we've also run a whole bunch of stakeholder dialogues, and those are often very generative for hearing about things going on, even meetings like this. And then thirdly, we've got a whole bunch of students and research projects now focusing on this. And I'm going to just talk briefly about a couple that are being done at the CST. Some of these people, Julia and Kezia, are at this meeting, but we've been doing a whole bunch of different kinds of sort of focus areas for looking at these seeds. So Julia worked on invasive species, Nyasha's working on transformations in the food system across Africa, Kezia is doing social-ecological stewardship, and then we've got Reinette, who's a new PhD student focusing more on conservation systems and youth-led innovations. So we've had a kind of a changing constellation of people working in different ways, but then also kind of advancing the approach. And now I'm going to just focus in on one example that actually draws on a couple of these different projects. And it's a paper that's actually been led by Julia, who's also at this meeting, that's currently under review. It was really trying to look at focus in on a subset of these seeds that have some sort of equity impacts as well as sustainability impacts. And I think in our context, that's a really big issue. So what we did is we selected 24 seeds from 6 different countries that basically is building on previous work that we've been doing, but we also had identified them through internet searches, literature reviews, etc. And we ended up focusing on the food system just for some more comparability. And we picked seeds that are really across the full food value chain, from food production all the way to consumption. But we also had a few seeds, but you can see it's very few of them, that look at trying to impact the broader institutional environment or some of the underlying ecosystem conditions. And then in general, what we do is the researchers will do quite in-depth kind of semi-structured interviews with the leaders of those seeds and ask them about some of the barriers, the opportunities, what got them motivated to start the seed, what helped get them off the ground, and then also looking at some of the impacts. And this is just an example of some of what came out of that particular analysis was thinking about some of the sustainability and equity impacts. So a lot around focusing on self-sufficiency for vulnerable groups, increasing kind of economic or livelihood opportunities, being more efficient about the use of resources. I think a growing focus on really reclaiming space or for the commons, and this idea of commoning, so etc. You can see here. And then we've also looked quite a lot at what are the different kinds of benefits that are being derived from these projects. So that's in these blue circles. So in this particular set of seeds we analyzed, there's a lot of focus on skills development, income security, improved nutrition, all the way through to kind of land ownership and legal recognition. And then we also try to understand who the main beneficiaries are that are being targeted or are benefiting from the particular kind of seed initiatives. And you can see here a big focus on women and children, but much less focus, for instance, on the elderly or disabled. So I think that is quite nice just to see what is being done and how might we also learn from particular kinds of seeds about how to do things better. And I think that's really our key motivation. And this is maybe a kind of a way that we then try to identify which are potentially some of the seeds that might be the most transformative or impact things in the kind of the broadest way. So some of you might be familiar with this idea that equity has kind of 3 dimensions that people often think about. And the first is this idea of distributional equity, which is probably the one we intuitively often think of the most, which is more around the distribution of benefits or services. So it's a kind of distributing stuff amongst people, whether that's water or land, etc. And we found those yellow dots are seeds that contribute to distributional equity out of our analysis. So you can see a lot of focus on that. But what we also know from kind of work on equity is that, for instance, recognitional equity is also really important, which is really around recognizing people and not discriminating against different groups of people on the basis of gender, ethnic group, age, etc. And you can see from this analysis, we actually didn't find any seeds that only focus on that. We do find there were those 4 seeds that are sort of greenish yellow that did a little bit of both. But that's maybe a place that's a little bit underemphasized. And then there's also procedural equity, which is around the ability of people to participate in processes that affect them. And that this would be also, for instance, around decision-making processes. And again, we see that there are actually very few of the initiatives that we identified in this group that are really targeting this kind of aspect of equity. But what we do find here in the middle, you'll see there are 4 seeds that are those bluish colors. They're actually ones that did something of all of those three types of equity. So that gives us also a way of trying to identify, wow, these are particularly interesting seeds that are actually really trying to address multiple dimensions of equity, and then trying to look more deeply into what are they doing, how are they doing it. But I think a lot of our kind of work going forward is also trying to then do some more longer term studies on some of these initiatives to try to understand their longer term impact. Because as they are, many of them are startups, they kind of start up and then often, they die down. But I think I think also interesting in that regard is a bit in the metaphor of the seed is also, you might have some seeds that kind of come there, but in a sense they prepare the ground. So even if they go away, they've sometimes already changed the system in a way that other things that couldn't take root can now take root. So I think it's also trying to broaden the way that we think about the whole process of change and not just think, I think often people are maybe overly focused on here's an initiative, can we scale it up and can it survive long term? But it's a much more complex process in terms of things building on one another, linking together, maybe changing themselves in a way that they almost become unrecognizable. So it's tracking also that process of change. So that was just sort of a little aside to give a little bit more depth on some of the analyses we're doing. But then I'm going to step back to sort of just talking about some of the other components of the project. So the other one was, I think, really important part of the whole process, and in the sense of also working in kind of a co-production sense, and also trying to kind of shape the way people think and see the world, and particularly also trying to help facilitate different kind of seeds or initiatives to connect with one another and learn from one another. So we also run quite a lot of workshops, conferences, and especially these visioning processes that we really also, a big focus of them is also trying to help build these or just foster and make space for these informal networks. And in a sense, a meeting like this is itself also doing quite a lot of that kind of work. And we know that this sort of shadow networks, as they've been referred to, can be also really critical for transformative change or building system change. So you get different actors that maybe are not in positions of a lot of authority or power in the current system, but they're connecting and doing things. And when an opportunity, this sort of window of opportunity arises, sometimes those people as a collective can step into that space and do things differently. Then to kind of talk just a little bit about this visioning process. And I think this has been really fun. And initially was a lot of the focus in this project was actually initially more on the scenarios, and then we started focusing more on the seeds. Now we're trying to get more to the pathways. But this process that we developed is actually, we kind of called it the Manoa mashup, but it draws on a couple of different futures approaches and tools. I'll talk briefly about them, but it includes futures wheels and the 3 horizons framework and a couple of other things. But it's really, it's a bit of a departure from the kind of mainstream way of thinking about scenarios or visions, where you take the major drivers of change, so say population growth or climate change, and then you maybe think about what are the kind of key uncertainties and explore those, but you're quite locked into the big drivers. This is kind of a different kind of philosophy to looking at the future, which it sort of ignores, in a sense, at first, the big drivers and tries to look at what are things that are more further out on the margin. So it could be these kinds of seed initiatives that can shape the future. And I think, especially in kind of futures thinking and futures work, what we know is that most of the time, the longer term future actually gets more shaped, or there are lots of unexpected things that happen. And it generally doesn't stay only within quite narrow pathways of change. And especially if we're thinking about kind of bigger transformative change, we will almost expect that more kind of out there things may be happening. So what we do in this process is to, I'll just talk briefly about it, is we take basically in the middle those 3 kind of yellow hexagons are the seeds, and we start with kind of 3 very different seeds, and we normally have 4 groups, so we got 12 seeds, and then for each of those seeds, we have a very mixed group of participants. So we normally have some scientists, but also some practitioners, maybe some people from government, regional and local government. We always try to have some artists and some students, So we have a whole lot of different people in the groups. And then you start with the middle and you basically try to build it out. And I know a couple of people here have been part of these processes, but it's quite intuitive. So you just think, okay, if this little initiative wasn't just a small seed, say community currency, but that was like the way the whole world worked. Everyone was using these kind of local community currencies. Like, what would the world look like and what would be the implications? And then you take 3 of those that are quite different and you connect them up into one bigger vision. And it's often quite a wacky vision. It feels it's interesting because you quite quickly get almost to a science fiction kind of space, but it's interesting that the participants often feed back and say they can really see this happening. And I think it's also the power of using things that are already in the world and then just applying kind of a sort of logic. And this is just part of the processes. We normally do a little play at the end, so it's also about this idea of experiential futures. So it's not just sort of in your mind, but in your body. And then we get people to act out their scenario and talk about the impacts. And I think this one I always remember from our very first workshop where, this group at CST sort of pioneered this scenarios method. And this is a couple of quite high-level academics and policy people that put on this post-Exodus show about people that live very, very long because of a new kind of gene editing technology. So then I'll just get to the last part, is around exploring pathways. And as I mentioned, this is, I think, really now the focus of a lot of our work. This tool called the 3 Horizons tool we found extremely helpful and valuable in thinking about the future. And I think if people are engaged in kind of futures process, I would really encourage you to look at this tool. So firstly, you'll recognize this also from our theory of change, is we look at these kind of little pockets of the future that are embedded in the present, so these sort of seeds, and think about what would they need to kind of grow into the future. So that's very much the kind of the scenarios process we've done. But then we also look at what are the things that are currently dominant. So the y-axis shows the kind of current dominance or the dominance of particular ways of doing things. And so we also consider what is it that's currently dominant. Obviously big things like the fossil fuel industry that need to decline in order to give space for these new things to grow. But you can kind of think through them quite systematically. And then I think the interesting one is really this kind of crossover. So sometimes there may be sort of bridging things that are needed to get from where we are now to the future. But sometimes it's also just a zone of conflict, like where the X is. And that changeover and how can that kind of be managed. But there we really try to think through, like, what are the kind of key leverage points or places where we could intervene? What are some of the enabling conditions? What are some of the key barriers? And then I think this is really important, also linking back to that theory of change. What are the potential kind of capture points where people that are currently dominant in the system might go down, but then they kind of capture these new things that are arising. So just to end off with some emerging insights from the work that we've done here in Southern Africa, but also in the work that's been done in Sweden and elsewhere in the world. So in looking at these different sort of visions or scenarios that we've developed using this Manoa mashup process, I think there have been a lot of similarities, which one can also think about is maybe the way that we're doing things, but it is quite interesting. So the first one is really this role of technology is really critical in terms of many of the scenarios and enabling kind of a good future in the sense of helping to connect people, reducing environmental impact, but there's a big role for technology. And that's actually quite a controversial one, because some people who participate are actually quite sort of anti-technology, but it really comes out as very key. There's really a big shift across these scenarios to much more kind of decentralized participatory decision-making processes that are also enabled by technology. A third one that there's big shifts in kind of across these scenarios is the nature of work. And that's really where also kind of the logic of our current system is kind of challenged and breaks down, but that people are not working to earn money to live only, but that it becomes about much more focus on contributing to the community. And so is also these kind of, a lot of the scenarios maybe have elements of kind of basic income grants, etc. Okay. And then there's shift to post-consumerism, and then that collaboration is a key ethic. And then some of the key risks that we've identified are really around these entrenched power structures that we have present in the world already, and how those can either kind of capture new things, but or kind of prevent change from happening. I think another big one that's also linked to social media and technology is around divergent values and societal groups, and especially I think people kind of get partly into these echo chambers or living kind of quite sort of separated from one another, and that clearly, like a lot of what needs to happen is to have connections across the world and the region and different groups of people, but people can become quite isolated. And then technology, as I mentioned, is a bit of a double-edged sword. Then I'll just end off with some of the potential leverage points that we've identified in this work to date that maybe also can kind of inform some of your work at different scales. So the first, as I highlighted in the beginning, is really around the power of these compelling visions that can kind of provide direction for innovation, and that these kind of science-society partnership can really help develop those, but then also help kind of set these platforms for broad-based action. And I think meetings like this are really important in that regard. Then secondly is around fostering, identifying, connecting, and supporting these kind of small-scale innovations and different ways of doing things. And then potentially also, I think, thinking more strategically about where do we invest strategically in a sense of supporting the kinds of seeds that change the ground and change the conditions for other things to also emerge more by themselves. Then thirdly, thinking around weakening the dominant structural forces that block change, and a lot of this is around the rules of the game, and but also how certain players are in powerful positions and perpetuate those rules. And then I think fourthly, and I think this is where a lot of work is going now, is really on exploring and co-developing governance and institutional arrangements that especially can also help us navigate these emerging pathways that we know will have very high levels of uncertainty and unpredictability as we deal with new things emerging, even while we have some direction. So that's it, and there's a lot of resources on this website if you're interested in more information.